In February, we restarted our face-to-face meetings, and since then we have had plenty to do. We've been organising speakers for future meetings, we've been getting out into the community, doing all those events that we used to do. We've just generally been finding our feet again, starting new projects, trying to settle back into the routine that we used to have up until 2019. Combining it, of course, with the newer things that we've done in the last couple of years too. Everything's changing. One of those changes happened between April 2020 and November 2021. The best we could offer our members and supporters was video talks on YouTube, with Zoom alternatives coming in for part of that period towards the end as well. It's been over a year now since we created a virtual talk, but as Christmas 2022 approached, we realised that a couple of our publications actually centre on records which may have brought a bit of festive cheer to the residents of Burscough on the Leeds and Liverpool Canal. Production of this seasonal talk has been slightly delayed, but some would actually argue that Christmastide only ends with the Feast of the Epiphany on the 6th of January. I'm filming this on the 2nd of January, which technically means that it is still the Christmas season. Just enough time to tell you about a particular kind of Christmas charity that was available to the residents of Burscough around about 200 years ago. Why don't we step back in time now? About 210 years and 2 weeks, give or take. It's the 18th of December, 1812. George III has been the British monarch for 52 years. It's 42 years since Charles Mordaunt of Halsall Hall ceremonially dug the first piece of earth to start what the Cumberland Packet and Ware's Whitehaven Gazette, a newspaper of the time, would one day call that stupendous undertaking the Leeds and Liverpool Canal. It's 29 years and about a month since the last British soldiers left New York City after the American War of Independence. And over in Lancashire, a couple of notes about charitable donations are made in the township books for Burscough. The lovely thing about that little extract is that those specific details match exactly with some other details from another of our publications. Originally available on CD, our Burscough beef records have recently been upgraded to a digital download. So for those who want to know more about that, I will put a link in the description box so you can find out more if you wish. The Burscough beef records include the records for 1812, when 75 poor householders from Burscough each received a joint of beef at Christmas. Effectively, it was a kind of food parcel. And the list from 1812 is also dated the 18th of December. So you can see an overlap between the beef lists and also the township books. Things are synchronising already. Several years ago, Ormskirk and District Family History Society transcribed a small collection of local papers which are stored at the Lancashire Archives in Preston. Formally, the Archives catalogue describes these as a list of poor housekeepers of Burscough who had beef. What exactly do they mean by this? We might interpret it as keepers of the local poorhouse, i.e. the workhouse. Or it could mean people who had their own household or home but had fallen on hard times. From the information available in the collection, I think that the latter is more likely. And this collection is really very brief. It's 14 lists of names on 14 sheets of paper. Not much to go on. But to the average family historian, these lists do serve a useful purpose. Every single one of them begins with a date in December, which suggests that this beef was being distributed to provide a Christmas dinner for people who wouldn't otherwise have been able to afford it. The lists cover a 25-year period, 1800 to 1825. So what we've also got here is a resource that predates the 1841 census. The lists are not just numbers of people, they actually supply the names of people who received this beef. So these people must have lived in the township of Burscough. There must have been that criteria that made them eligible to benefit from charities that were set up to help those in the local area. The list for 1817, for example, gives the names of 90 people who received this donation of beef. And we included photos of the original documents when we first released this information on CD, and they are quite interesting. The first list is dated the 19th of December 1800, but then the date is crossed out and it's been changed to the 18th of December 1801, so the following year. Similarly, the 1807 list seems to have been recycled for the beef donations of 1808, the one for 1809 is reused in 1810. And this is where it gets interesting. When you compare the 1800-1801 list, you find that 6 of the names from 1800, there were 60 names in all that year, are crossed out, which makes you wonder whether they had died in the 12 months that followed. Or maybe they'd prospered enough over the previous year that they just no longer needed the donation of beef, they were not reliant on local charity anymore. Perhaps this is also an example of the local authorities doing what they could to save money by reusing the same piece of paper twice. It's a possibility, we can only really guess, but it's interesting to speculate. The really useful thing about this collection of lists is that they span a 25-year period, effectively one generation. So by counting up the overall numbers of recipients, the number of men and the number of women for each available year, there are some gaps. We can see that in general terms, the demand for these beef donations did increase over time. It's often said that you can do anything you want to with statistics, and the Burscough beef records are a perfect example of this. The number of recipients varies from year to year. 1801 sees the lowest number, there's just 52 people. But there's a steady increase to 75 in 1812 and 1815. And then there's a spike from 90 in 1817 to 84 in 1820. But why has the number increased? Has life become harder in Burscough? Is there some local economic depression being hinted at here? Or is it something else entirely? For the family historian, one of the go-to resources is, of course, the census records. Many of us are familiar with the ones covering the years between 1841 and 1911, and in fact since January of 2022, probably those for 1921 as well. Those tend to be readily accessible on most of the major family history websites. But in fact censuses were taken every 10 years from 1801 onwards. So there were ones predating 1841, and there are other various local equivalents from all sorts of years before that. Sometimes you can find references to statistics from 1801 onwards in other local resources. For instance, Mannex's Directory of Mid Lancashire for 1854 gives us some idea of the pre-1841 population statistics for Burscough, and these cross-referencing again with the Burscough Township books, we find that a note was made on the 27th of May 1811 regarding that year's census, and that information exactly matches the details that were given in Mannex's directory. Taking the number of inhabitants, males 761, females 731, total 1,492 souls. So in 1811 we know that almost 1,500 people lived in Burscough. The Burscough beef records also cover the year 1811. They tell us that 68 people, so just 4.55% of the inhabitants, if you get a calculator out, received that donation of beef that Christmas of 1811. 50 of the recipients were male and 18 of them were female. So that's 2.46% of Burscough's female population. So it doesn't take too long to realise that this charity was reserved for the benefit of a very tiny fraction of the population of Burscough as a whole. At Christmas 1811, fewer than 1 in 20 people would have received that donation of beef. One other reference to the census comes on the 4th of July 1821, when the township books tell us that £1.05 was paid to the High Constable for taking the number of inhabitants. No specific figures are given in that particular record, but thanks to Mannex's directory, we do know that there were 755 residents of Burscough in 1821. And that very same year, 120 people received donations of beef that Christmas, which equates to 6.83% of the population. So that's a bit of an increase on 1811, really. As you are doubtless aware, especially if you've seen some of our other videos, things were changing in Burscough in the early 1800s, in fact in the late 1700s too. In 1816, the main branch of the Leeds and Liverpool Canal was finally complete. It was formally opened in the October of that year, creating a waterway that went all the way from the port of Liverpool in what was then still Lancashire to the city of Leeds in Yorkshire. and it also linked to various other towns and villages along the way. Bingley and Skipton in Yorkshire, East Marton and Barnoldswick on the Lancashire-Yorkshire border, Burnley and Blackburn, Adlington, Wigan, Apley Bridge, and then you get onto the area that our society is interested in. You've got Rufford, Latham, Burscough, Scarisbrick, Holsall, Haskane, Down Holland, Lydiate, Maghull, Melling, and then it heads off to Aintree, Litherland, Bootle, and finally out to sea at Liverpool. You can imagine that at any one time, anything could have been transported from either direction through Burscough by water, by the boatmen on the canal. So there is always a chance that at least a few boatmen were passing through the village on a daily basis, and later decided that that was where they and their families wanted to settle more permanently. So that again might account for the increasing population over time. The Burscough beef records are not a census by any stretch of the imagination. They don't record the marital status of every individual, nothing is said about the age, nothing is said about where they were born. But what they do show is that a number of recipients were widows, not widowers. We're talking about women largely here. And the number of widows mentioned stays fairly consistent until 1815, when there is a sharp rise to 8 in 1817. Again, we're only talking about groups of maybe 60 or so people, 60 to 80 roughly speaking. 8 is quite a chunk of a small group really. And then it goes up to 14 widows in 1819. Older widows, perhaps those say 40 and upwards, may have been living alone. Perhaps they are now past childbearing age or towards the end of their childbearing years. Their adult children may well have grown up and moved away from the area. That may be why they are in a state of relative destitution and needing this charitable handout at Christmas. Younger widows, we'll say those from 20 to 25 to 40, the sort of age when you might expect them to have been married a few years before the husbands died, could still have had dependent children. The ones who we would call school age today, perhaps 5 to 12 years old, even if they didn't attend school in actual fact. Because in 1825, the last year for which we have these Burscough beef records, there was still no law to say that children had to attend school. The Education Act of 1870 was 2 generations away. It was far more likely to have affected the grandchildren or great-grandchildren of any women, any widows on the Burscough beef lists. And in many cases in the earlier part of the 19th century, and in fact well into the later half of the 19th century too, most parents or guardians would have been expected to pay a small sum, perhaps a penny a day per child, to send their offspring to school. And it is entirely possible that the families of Burscough, particularly the people who are named on the Burscough beef list, who were getting charitable handouts, simply did not have that money to spare to send their children to school. What would those children have done instead? Burscough is an area of farmland, it's agricultural, as is much of West Lancashire. The sons that these women had might have found employment as agricultural labourers or farmhands on any of the many farms in West Lancashire. But probably not until they were maybe 10 or 12 years old and big enough and strong enough to be vaguely useful around the farm or on the land. You're not going to really want very small children to be doing that kind of work. They won't have physical strength. Equally, any daughters of these women may not have left home to go into service, that is, become a domestic servant in someone else's house, someone else's farm, maybe somewhere more upmarket, somewhere like Scarisbrick Hall or Latham House, or even they might have gone to Liverpool or Preston. They might have been employed in the home of a prosperous merchant or trader, but again, not until they were probably 11 or 12 years old. So we certainly cannot discount the possibility that some of these widows would have had children to provide for. We can't really draw any proper conclusions about that just from the information in the beef lists. But what we can do is to plot out a graph to show how many widows were actually named in the beef lists and how the number of those receiving the donations rose over time. In some ways, the Burscough beef records are very informative. In others, they can be quite complex, a bit mysterious, not exactly straightforward. For instance, the records for 1809-1810 mention Widow Ryland's daughters. No number of daughters is stated, but we can assume that there were at least 2 of them, and if their mother is a widow, their father is almost certainly deceased. In general, you can work out fairly easily how many recipients were male and how many were female just by looking at the names. In general, there were far fewer women and girls receiving these food parcels than men and boys. But when I plotted the numbers out on a graph, I did notice something really interesting about the statistics for the years between 1817 and 1820. Did you notice that the number of males drops from 66 to 55, before increasing by almost 50% to 79? Meanwhile, there is a sharp increase in the number of females from 24 to 29 and then to 38 over that same period. So whether this is to do with soldiers returning home after the Napoleonic Wars ended in 1815, I'm not sure, but it is quite intriguing. If we move on a little further to 1820, it's noted that 12 of the women on the list are widows, and other recipients include John Orrill's daughters. Again, this is suggesting that there are a number of sisters in one household. Can we find out more about this? Yes, we can. Because baptism registers for St. Peter and St. Paul's Church in Ormskirk show that a couple named John and Elizabeth, or Betty, Orrell of Burscough, did have several children baptised in the 70s. In the middle of all this, another child was baptised apparently to the same couple at St. Mary the Virgin's Church in Rufford. This one was a boy, and his baptism actually reveals John's occupation. Parish records also show that John Orrell, aged 65, of Burscough in the parish of Ormskirk, was buried at St Mary the Virgin, Rufford, on the 28th of February 1818, which gives him an approximate birth year of 1753. By 1821, we see that there are 120 names on the list, but confusingly 3 of them have been crossed out. John Ashton, Widow Hewitt, Mary Leatherbarrow, and there's also a note next to Phoebe Maudsley's name which simply reads dead. But this is where things get a little confusing, because there is a burial record for Phoebe Maudsley, aged 73, of Ormskirk, but it's dated the 11th of March 1823. She was buried at St Peter and Paul's in Ormskirk. She was most definitely alive in the Christmas of 1821. There is a logic to a person from Burscough being buried at Ormskirk. The Church of St John the Baptist at Burscough wasn't consecrated until 1832, and even then it remained a part of the parish of Ormskirk until 1849, when it became a parish in its own right and it was no longer part of the parish of Ormskirk. So this also helps to explain why John Orrell's burial record gave his address as Burscough in the parish of Ormskirk back in 1818. When you put the pieces together and you research the information, it starts to make a lot more sense. A year later, 1822, we find 121 names now. One is crossed out. Once again, there is a note next to Phoebe Maudsley's name, which simply reads dead. So she's appeared twice and been noted down as dead before she'd actually died. Could it be that whoever wrote up the lists just went back through some of the earlier versions and annotated them after the fact, so they're recording her as dead from years when she was technically still alive? This year is interesting because in 1822 somebody actually bothered to make an extra separate note to let us know that Edward Bank and Thomas Holcroft were the men who supplied this massive quantity of beef to feed 121 people. By 1824, 134 people receive the Christmas beef, and these include 18 widows. And now the word dead is written next to 5 names: Margaret Green, Sarah Leatherbarrow, James Hadwick, Martha Baybutt, and Will Farrington Sr. I noticed that again there is a logic to this, because a Will Farrington Jr. also appears on the list, so they need a method of differentiating between the two. Burial records for all 3 of the women stated to have been dead have been found, but as yet, very mysteriously, no entries matching the men's names have turned up yet. If you found them in your family tree, please leave us a comment and let us know. As with the 1822 list, it seems that the names from 1824 were edited in preparation for the Christmas of 1825. And finally, in the last year, 1825, there's a sharp fall, only 112 recipients that year. 16 widows mentioned, of which one name is crossed out, Widow Cave. Another person, Widow Corliss, is noted to be dead. Unfortunately, despite her interesting surname, Corliss, I can't quite work out where she was buried. I'm still looking for that. Again, if anybody has come across a widowed lady named Corliss who died in the mid-1820s, do let us know. She is a bit of a puzzle. There's always an element of social history and family history, and I think we can reasonably deduce that these lists are talking about inhabitants of Burscough who were far from wealthy, but were still not completely destitute. They must have had enough of an income that they were still able to presumably rent their own homes. They have not yet fallen on such hard times that they have had to seek refuge in the local workhouse. But even so, it looks as though obtaining a decent piece of beef to have their Christmas dinner is just beyond their limited budget. So perhaps whoever originally gave orders for this beef donation knew that having that Christmas meal was an important small luxury at exactly the time of year when the wealthier classes were expected to offer charity and a bit of humanity to those who really needed it. And whoever this anonymous donor was, they provided the money to do exactly that. But I think there's one other little question that maybe needs considering. Why was beef chosen rather than something like a goose, as mentioned in Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, or turkey, which many of us associate with Christmas today? There may be a simple explanation for that. In the early 1800s, roast beef was actually considered to be the Christmas staple. It's one of the Christmas traditional dishes. In an article about Victorian Christmas customs that I found on the Historic UK website, I'm going to put a link to that in the description too, Ben Jonson notes that even in the 1830s, when George III's granddaughter Victoria ascended the throne, whilst in London and southern England they were following the latest trend of roasting a goose for Christmas Day, in the north, which of course is where Lancashire is, and more specifically Ormskirk and Burscough, many people still resolutely stuck to the more traditional beef. So the parcels of beef being handed out in Burscough in the early 1800s may simply be a reflection of what the local community considered to be a traditional Christmas meal. They wanted the familiarity, the usual customs, the usual foods that they associated with the festive period. And why indeed not? Everybody wants to keep their Christmas traditions alive, just the same as we do now. So I hope that you've enjoyed this dive into one of our more unusual collections of records. It's always an interesting one to describe, the Burscough beef list. So I hope that this has helped to explain a bit more about one of the more mysterious titles on our sales list. Although it is a little late now to wish you a Merry Christmas if you are watching this in early 2023, perhaps if you are watching this at the end of 2023, we can also wish you a very Merry Christmas too, and a Happy New Year, whatever year it happens to be.